the 17th of July 1917, King George V stood before his court and made a decision that would quietly rewrite history. With a single proclamation, his family name disappeared. The House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha gone. Erased from official record. Replaced overnight by something new. Something simpler. Something that sounded unmistakably British. The House of Windsor. The public accepted it immediately. No resistance. No investigation. No questions. But here's the part history rarely emphasizes. Royal families do not change their names lightly. A name is more than identity. It is lineage, power, continuity. And for centuries, European dynasties protected that continuity at all costs. So the question isn't why the name changed. The question is, what made it necessary? Because whatever the answer is, it was strong enough to erase an entire royal identity in a single day. The official explanation is straightforward. In 1917, Britain was deep in World War I. Anti-German sentiment had reached a boiling point. German businesses were attacked. German names were removed from streets, buildings, even family records. And at the center of it all was the royal family. Their name, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, was unmistakably German. To make matters worse, King George V was the first cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm II, a British king with a German name, related to the leader of the enemy nation. Politically, it was a disaster. So, according to history, the solution was simple. Change the name. Windsor was chosen, inspired by Windsor Castle. It sounded ancient. It sounded English. It felt safe. And just like that, the problem disappeared. At least on the surface. Because explanations that seem too clean usually are. Before the name Windsor, before Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, there was another lineage, the Wettin family, a dynasty that ruled parts of what is now Germany for nearly 1,000 years. Their documented history traces back to the 10th century, centered in the region of Saxony. This is where the official genealogy begins. When Queen Victoria married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, the Wettin bloodline entered the British royal succession. Their son, Edward VII, became the first British monarch of that line, and his son, George V, renamed the dynasty Windsor. But here is where things become unclear. The Wettin records do not go back indefinitely. They stop, abruptly, at the edge of early medieval documentation. And that is exactly where the questions begin, because history that ends suddenly usually has something before it. Now consider something rarely discussed in mainstream history. For centuries, European maps showed a vast region labeled Tartary, not a small territory, an enormous one, stretching across what we now call Russia, Central Asia, and parts of Eastern Europe. These maps were not obscure. They were created by Dutch, French, and British cartographers, some of the most respected mapmakers of their time. And they all agreed on one thing. Tartary existed. It was large, and it mattered. Today, the official explanation is that Tartary was simply a loose term used to describe lands inhabited by various nomadic groups. A convenient label. Nothing more. But that explanation leaves gaps, because what appears on those maps looks less like scattered tribes and more like a structured, unified territory. Something organized. Something established. And then, by the 19th century, the name disappears completely. No transition. No clear replacement. Just gone. At the center of this alternative framework is something known as the reset theory. The idea is simply, but the implications are not. It suggests that a large-scale catastrophic event occurred sometime between the 18th and early 19th centuries. An event that buried large portions of an earlier civilization. Evidence for this is often pointed to in architecture. Across Europe and parts of Asia, there are buildings with lower floors partially underground, windows that begin below the current ground level, basements that appear to have once been the original first floor. The official explanation is gradual soil accumulation over time. but critics argue the pattern is too consistent, too uniform, too widespread across regions that supposedly developed independently. In this interpretation, something happened. A reset. A disruption significant enough to bury infrastructure, and with it, the memory of what came before. If that is true, then the societies that emerged afterward didn't build from nothing. They inherited, reused, reframed, and most importantly, rewrote the narrative. If a reset did occur, then the question becomes unavoidable. Who came after? And more importantly, who stayed in power? This is where the bloodline theory enters the discussion. It suggests that certain families did not disappear during whatever disruption took place. Instead, they maintained continuity. They preserved knowledge, structures, systems of governance, while the general population lost access to that information. In this framework, medieval ruling families are not simply local nobles who rose gradually over time. They are something else. An administrative class, a group that already understood how large-scale systems worked because they had operated them before. Their rise to power would not have been accidental. It would have been systematic, strategic. And when you look at how quickly certain dynasties established control over key regions, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. They didn't just acquire land, they secured infrastructure, positions that suggest prior knowledge, not discovery. Now, look at the geography, because this is where things start to align. The Wettin dynasty emerged in Saxonia region, positioned at the western edge of what old maps labelled as Tartary, not the centre. The edge, a border zone. If Tartary was a large, structured civilization that later collapsed, and if groups from that system moved westward, this is exactly where they would appear in the historical record. Not deep inside Europe, but at the boundary between two worlds. And that's what we see. The timing aligns. The location aligns. Even the naming conventions raise questions. Saxe-Coburg-Gotha is not a traditional family name. It's a collection of territorial designations, almost administrative. And when you examine the locations these families controlled, you see a pattern: river crossings, trade routes, strategic high ground, positions that suggest knowledge, not luck. The official explanation says the name change in 1917 was about public perception. But history shows something different. Royal families do not abandon their names easily. Not during war. Not under pressure. Not even when empires collapse. The name is the bloodline. To change it is to break continuity, unless the name itself becomes a liability. Not politically, but historically. What if Saxe-Coburg-Gotha pointed somewhere deeper? Somewhere that, if followed far enough, would lead to questions the establishment could not answer, or worse, could not allow. In that context, the name change looks less like a public relations move and more like a deliberate cut, a way to sever a trail, a way to make sure no one could easily trace the lineage back beyond a certain point. Because sometimes the most important thing isn't what you change, it's what you're trying to hide. The name Windsor still exists. The monarchy still stands. The story, officially, is complete. But the traces remain. Old maps that still show Tartary. Buildings with buried lower floors. Genealogies that stop exactly where the questions begin. And a name, abandoned in 1917, that may have pointed to something far older than a wartime alliance. If the past was rewritten, it wasn't erased completely. It was edited, layered, reframed just enough to be accepted. The question is not whether the change happened. It did. The question is, what existed before it? And why was it important enough to disappear? If this made you question something you thought you understood, subscribe, because this is only the beginning.